In this, the second lesson on John Webster's Duchess of Malfi, we study the elements of horror within the play. We also look at the role played by gender and patriarchy, as well as by class issues and mobility within the play. We will also look briefly at the role of the private and the public and how it is played out. Webster's Duchess of Malfi is significant in that it seems to be completely a very dark play. Even though it begins when the Duchess is newly widowed, what we see is that her life is constrained by her brothers. And though we have two scenes which are seen as light, playful, and very loving, the scenes between Antonio, Quariola, and the Duchess, most of the play is extremely dark and extremely somber. What we see is that the brothers, they extend their reach over the entire play. Whatever the location might be, it is their power that is seen and felt by the Duchess and all her people. So even when we have small children on stage, we see them as suffering and tortured rather than as being carriers of light and happiness. The horrors of the central section of the Duchess of Malfi are particularly significant. There are scenes one after the other which then show us the Duchess being tortured. So you have a scene wherein she is given the severed hand of a dead person and told that it is the hand of her husband. We are shown bodies which she is told belong to her husband and her child. And then, of course, she is plagued by madmen who are set around her house and who then caterwaul, sing, dance, and create havoc around her place so that she is driven demented herself. Those three central scenes also, in a sense, epitomize the horror, the Gothic nature of the play itself. That this is a play which is predicated upon a certain horrific vision of mankind, that mankind is out to torture, that mankind is out to in any way torment all others. And then we see, of course, the death of the Duchess, a death which is singularly dignified and which is noble and which also then changes the character of Bosola. But that does not necessarily mean that the play is then given a certain light relief. After that point, if it is possible at all, the play becomes darker, because what we see is that even as Bosola determines that he will avenge the Duchess as well as himself upon her brothers, he is then thwarted. His hopes of doing something noble by saving Antonio are thwarted because he himself kills Antonio. In addition, we see the Duke of Milan, Ferdinand, the Duchess's twin brother, descend into lycanthropy, wherein then he behaves like a wolf and believes that he is a wolf. So he is driven mad. We also see the cardinal, the so-called man of God, killing his own mistress by making her kiss a poison book. So the entire play proceeds from one horror to the other, until of course it ends with the customary tragic end of most tragedies in the Renaissance, wherein you have a pile of bodies upon stage. But the unrelieved horror of the Duchess of Malfi lies not in the end itself, but in the progressive darkness which encroaches upon the viewers/readers throughout the course of the play. So horror is piled upon horror, and we are not really given any hope that there can be any element of light and of relief within the entire play. We will now look at gender and patriarchy within this text. And this is a central issue because, titled of course The Duchess of Malfi, we are focusing upon a woman character, but we do not focus upon just one woman character. We see a variety of them. The Duchess of Malfi as a character has already been discussed, but the Duchess of Malfi is not just a character but also a type within this play. What we see is that, first of all, women are reduced to their sexual roles within the play. That women's sexuality forms the cornerstone of their identity for the men in this play. Both the brothers of the Duchess, Ferdinand as well as the Cardinal, are obsessive about their sister's sexual desires. So they both speak about the fact that she will hasten into bed with the first willing person now that her husband is no more. The monstrous sexual appetite of women is something that then serves them as a pretext for denying her the opportunity to get marriage. In addition, we are reminded also that in addition to the sexual identity, women are seen as only possessing two kinds of identities. One is their natal identity, so as daughter and sister, and the second is their marital identity as wife or as widow. And here the Duchess falls into both those roles, because we see her as the sister of the Aragonian brothers and we see her as the widow of the Duke of Malfi. She is not allowed to escape from these determined roles, predetermined roles for her, into a role wherein she is just herself. There is no point at which the Duchess of Malfi can be a desiring woman, a woman who is married to Antonio, somebody who wants a life of her own. No, that is not a choice which is possible for her. So in that sense, the Duchess of Malfi, the play, is a stereotypical representation of women which stems from the ideas of women that were circulating during this period in England. It is interesting also, of course, that once she is widowed, the Duchess is seen as a source of threat by her brothers. This is because widows in the Renaissance period in England were seen as enjoying more power because they had then a certain degree of independence from their previous lives. So when she is widowed, as the Duchess demonstrates, she has a certain degree of power over her own life. She can choose whom she will marry. It does not necessarily have to be in accordance with the desires of her family and her menfolk. Instead, she can do what she wants. This source of power is also, of course, seen as being threatening by the remaining men. So both Ferdinand as well as the cardinal enjoin upon her that she should not get married, and that by getting married she will be devaluing her name as well as her lineage and them as well. So what we have is therefore then a representation of a woman who, even as she tries to escape from the gender roles that have been prescribed for her by the patriarchal society which she lives in, she is also then caught in that trap and further made to conform to it. The obsession with women's sexuality is also seen once again in the relationship between the cardinal and Julia, his mistress, where over and over again we are told that he has a liaison with Julia in spite of the fact that her husband also is in the court. But that liaison is also in a sense determined by the fact that her husband takes advantage of his wife's sexual affairs so that he can then have certain rights over the property she might get from the cardinal. So women's sexuality as a way of getting what you want, using women to get what you want, is also something that we see in the play. We are also given, of course, this extremely misogynist attitude towards women in the portrayal of the midwife with whom Bosola enjoys a conversation, wherein he speaks contemptuously of all women as being deceitful, as evidenced by the fact that they paint their faces and that they all are duplicitous. Thus, the representation of women within the play is one which is consistently negative and which is also predicated upon them as having no identity other than their sexual identities or their natal/marital identities. We also are told about something else within the play, and that is this conflict which is about women seen as stereotypical. So you have the Duchess who is either perfectly good or perfectly evil. For her brothers, she becomes perfectly evil once she is married or once she is having an affair with somebody and producing child after child after child. Whereas for Antonio, she is seen as perfectly good. So you do not really see a woman as just a woman, somebody who might be flawed but might still have certain good qualities to her. She is also, of course, shown to us as being somebody who is not allowed to have personal desires. So when she speaks to Antonio and says that she would woo him because she is the prince and he would never be able to woo her, we see her in a personal role. But is it possible for her herself to escape this role is a question that remains in the text and remains to be answered, because she herself is conflicted because of the clash between her role as a person, an individual, and her role as the Duchess of Malfi and the sister of the Aragonian brothers. We also see Cariola, who is the other female character whom we see alongside the Duchess through the play. Cariola is once again a stereotypical representation of a woman because she is shown to us as being this completely good servant. She has no other role other than to be supportive of her mistress. So she continuously is helpful to her mistress. She speaks to her, encourages her in all her requests, all her needs. She is helpful when the Duchess wants to arrange the assignations with Antonio. She serves her, she looks after her, and in the end she dies with her. or for her. So thus Cariola then is once again, in a sense, a representation of a woman who is not really a woman in that sense at all, because she is seen only as the good servant. What we also are told about is indirectly ideas of inheritance which come via the woman. Now, the idea of the Duchess of Malfi being the widow of the Duke of Malfi, having had a child by him, the child, the firstborn, the son, is the one who stands to inherit the dukedom of Malfi. And yet, what we have is the brothers who seem to think that they will inherit her wealth if she were to die without getting married again. So you have a conflict between the natal and the marital role of the woman once again. It is of course further complicated because Antonio, once he is married to the Duchess, might be the one who will then inherit her wealth. So the question of inheritance is something that crops up again and again within the play. It is of course at the end of the play that we come to the point where Delio, who has been given the charge of Antonio and the Duchess's eldest son, determines that now that son will be a contender for the dukedom of Malfi, which is an interesting point because what it brings us to is the idea that inheritance is via the mother and not via the father. If it is Antonio's son that we see that child as, then he has no rights to the dukedom of Malfi. Whereas if we see it as a Duchess's son, and it is as the Duchess's son that Delio decides that he should be a contender for the ruler, the position of ruler of Malfi, then we are also then complicating ideas of inheritance, which is basically about the firstborn of the husband who will then take over a kingdom. So in a play which is largely stereotypical in its representations of gender, patriarchal societies and women, we have one last blow which is struck by John Webster, where he complicates the idea of inheritance and makes it via the mother rather than via the father. There is also consistently seen in the play another stereotypical idea of widowed women, which was that they are susceptible to their stewards who will then marry them and improve their position. So what we see is when the Duchess marries the steward, she is replicating a story that used to circulate in Renaissance England, in Shakespeare's England, Jacobean England, that women who are widowed, women of high position, are usually then seen to marry their stewards because it serves the purposes of both the steward as well as the woman. The woman is given in marriage to a man who is lesser to her in stature in society. As a result, she has more power over him. Whereas a man, by marrying the woman who is higher in stature, improves his own stature and gets more respectability in society. This was of course also seen as problematic because a lot of these marriages were then, attempts were made to break up these marriages because it was seen as detrimental to the hierarchic aristocratic nature of society itself. But in the play what we see is that when the Duchess proposes this marriage, she claims that she is a ruler who will woo and who will marry Antonio. But she is not only a ruler, she is also of course a private person. And over here when after that she has many children and these children are introduced to her court, whereas the husband is kept a secret. The problem is that she is grown, and Webster uses the phrase, a notorious strumpet. She is seen as a common whore. So a woman's sexuality then, whether ruler or private individual, is still her determining feature. It is at the end of the play that we see the Duchess then having one single role within the play when she says, I am Duchess of Malfi still. Is it that at that point she renounces her marriage to Antonio? Because if she was Antonio's wife, she would not be claiming that she is Duchess of Malfi, because she would then be claiming herself to be Antonio's wife, the mother to Antonio's children. Instead, she claims, I am Duchess of Malfi still, which then means that she reverts to her position as being the widowed Duchess of the Duke of Malfi. So in this, her public persona is then singular. She is only the Duchess of Malfi. She is not the sister to Ferdinand and the Cardinal. She is not wife to Antonio. She is not mother to Antonio's children. She is only the Duchess of Malfi. So what we have is also then a woman who strives to define herself in terms that are familiar to the patriarchal society of its times. If the patriarchal society recognizes only titles and designations of a certain stature, then she tries to fit into that society by claiming so. We will now examine issues of class and mobility within the play. As we were just saying, it was common during, if not common, it was fairly common for rich widows to marry their stewards, and thus the stewards were themselves advanced in the hierarchic nature of society of the time. And the Duchess of Malfi begins with this popular idea and this image about class structures and stereotypes. The story of the rich widowed noblewoman who then gets married to her steward and who is then reviled by society for that steward is something that circulated across society. So it's not just an English story, but also a European story, if you will. And it is this story that we see. However, what complicates it over here is that we also see somebody else who is seeking advancement in the hierarchic society of the time. And that somebody is Bosola. Bosola is told, we are told by the playwright that Bosola is somebody who worked for the cardinal, who actually committed murder for the cardinal. So he becomes also in some senses a paid mercenary. He committed murder for the cardinal and yet was sold down the river by the cardinal. So the cardinal, who refuses to take responsibility for the murder, is then determined to also let Bosola take his chances. So he is sent into servitude upon the galleys. He returns from there, and yet Bosola has no other option but to come back to the cardinal and his brother if he wants to further himself in society. So the hierarchic society of the time is also seen as one which is short of opportunities for people who do not have access to the higher reaches of the hierarchy. So if you cannot get an aristocrat to endorse your desire for a better status, then you don't really have a chance. In that sense, Antonio is seen as being lucky because he marries the Duchess. And yet it is a question as to whether Antonio is really lucky. Does he really improve his status? Because he remains till the end of the play just a steward. In fact, once it is discovered that he is married to the Duchess, he has not even got the position of the steward of Malfi. Instead, what he has is nothing. He is exiled along with his son, and he has no access to either the Duchess or to any of the other family members who are of high stature. So when we look at Antonio and we try to see whether he gains anything by virtue of this marriage to the Duchess, which was actually seen in Elizabethan and Jacobean times as a way of advancing yourself in society, what we see is that actually Antonio gains nothing. He gains a certain degree of love from the Duchess, but that he would have gained in any marriage maybe. But other than that, social advancement does not come his way. Social advancement instead is actually held away from him, and in fact he falls rather than rises in the social ladder, because what happens is that once the marriage is discovered, he is banished from Malfi, he is exiled, and he loses his position as steward. And in fact, after that point, he has no real identity in the hierarchic society that he inhabits. It is then that he takes the decision to go to the Duchess's brothers and try to be reconciled to them, so that by doing so then he might have a chance at going back and gaining his position in the society that he has just vacated. On the other hand, what we see is also Bosola. Bosola, who tries very hard by virtue of his alliance with both the brothers, the cardinal initially and later Ferdinand, who tries to advance himself and his position, his status in society. He begins, of course, as a paid mercenary. He learns not to trust the cardinal because the cardinal betrays him and does not acknowledge his responsibility in the murder that Bosola committed, and eventually has to also serve out a prison term on the galleys for the murder that he committed for the cardinal. And yet he returns to the cardinal and Ferdinand, hoping for preferment from them. This raises a question as to whether there is any way at all which is possible, given the nature of the society of the times, for somebody who is born in a lower strata to advance himself or herself into a higher strata. Where women might have advanced themselves by virtue of a marriage, an advantageous marriage, for men the only possibility was to ally themselves with people of a higher stature who could then dispense a rank for them at their own convenience and for services rendered. Bosola tries this way. Bosola goes and works for Ferdinand. In fact, he works for many years for Ferdinand. Given the fact that there are 3 pregnancies on the part of the Duchess, we can at least assume that he works for 2.5 years for Ferdinand. And yet, when after having served Ferdinand loyally, having done all that was required of him, finally when he has killed the Duchess on behalf of Ferdinand, he is told by Ferdinand that he will not be paid and that he will die for the murder that he has committed. It is at this point that Bosola then of course swears revenge. Webster makes an interesting shift at this point. If thus far Bosola has been searching for advancement in the social world and in the political world of Italy, from this point onwards he determines that he will repent and he will turn to God. So you have a setting of the spiritual versus the social and the political, the earthly. Webster gives us the option that Bosola, if he cannot advance himself on earth in the courts of Italy, then he can choose to advance himself in the courts of heaven. And therefore then Bosola chooses to try and live a noble life, a good life. Which are the reasons that he gives for his sudden change around? Having killed the Duchess of Malfi, having been in a sense impressed by her behavior at the point of death and during her long torture, he then decides that maybe he should emulate that godliness is maybe a better alternative than searching for earthly advancement. It's an interesting question to think about, because what we have then is a play wherein we are constantly being reminded of earthly advantages. Instead, we have a principal character who turns around and determines that he will now seek for and sue for heavenly advancement, that it is the courts of heaven that will reward him for what he does, rather than earthly courts, which are anyway non-dependable. So then you have Bosola towards the end, who, when he goes to Milan and later on when he goes to the Cardinal's palace, he is looking for a way of redeeming himself. Redemption, penitence, and finally forgiveness. Forgiveness not here on earth, but forgiveness in heavenly terms or in spiritual terms is what Bosola looks for. It's a complicated issue that Webster raises, because then what Webster seems to say is also that the earth and what we can have on earth is strictly limited, whereas what we can have in heaven is of course unlimited, and therefore why not go for that? But it is also a way of reconciling people who might be ungrateful and who might rebel. It is a way of keeping them in their place. And here Bosola falls into that trap, because he then, instead of trying to revenge himself and try and gain what is rightfully his, prefers to kill the Aragonian brothers, yes, but also seek for redemption from heaven. In fact, at the end of the play, he says that he would rather have, instead of rank and position, he would rather taste of Providence's cup, which will, even as it makes him fall, it will raise him up. Interesting idea, because otherwise what we have in a play is people who are falling because of human faults, failing because of the fact that they trust in humans. Here instead you have Bosola who claims that he will trust in God, and God will raise him up even as he might seem to fail. So the social positions that are given by human beings are finally reduced to a certain degree of irrelevance by the playwright. After this, what we see is, of course, that as the play ends, there is nobody left alive except for Delio and this child, Antonio and the Duchess's child. And there, of course, once again you have the search for position, that there is going to be a standoff maybe between the Duke of Malfi's own legitimate son and Antonio and the Duchess's eldest son, whose claim is supported by Delio. The play leaves us with an open ending. We do not really know who gains what stature, but we do know that when Webster introduces the idea that providence and the gifts of providence are better than the gifts of earthly rulers, he is also introducing us to the idea that maybe we should wait for the hereafter rather than hope for a reconciliation and an advantage in the here and the now on earth. The Duchess of Malfi is a play that is very passionate. In fact, all the characters speak in tones and speak in words that reveals a very passionate engagement with each other as well as with life. They also have great hopes of what they want. So whether it is the Duchess who desires Antonio, Antonio who desires the Duchess, whether it is Bosola who desires preferment, whether it is Ferdinand and the Cardinal who desire to have their sister's wealth and who desire to have their sister remain a widow, they all speak in tones and words that reveal that they are passionately engaged with these ideas. It is also a play that is dark, unrelentingly so almost. We are not given much of happiness to look forward to. Instead, what we are given is an insight into the evil that rules men's hearts, rules men's minds. And particularly so do I say men, because it is the men in the play who ruin the possibility of happiness, even the possibility of happiness for a woman such as the Duchess. All the men, whether it is Antonio who does not have the courage to make their marriage public, Bosola who spies upon a woman and informs her brothers of all that she does, the brothers themselves who are then of course engaged in trying to keep her a widow rather than having her marry again, all of them are in relationship to the Duchess, engaged in keeping her from any possibility of happiness. It is a play that gives us not much to hope about. Even as it gives us an end wherein all the wicked people are wiped out, it also tells us that there is not really much justice to be hoped for, because Bosola dies. Bosola is never paid for anything that he does. And even Bosola's hopes of trying to help Antonio are reduced to nothing because he himself stabs Antonio. So there is a certain degree of randomness, a certain arbitrary nature of life and death, an element of the absurd which comes into this play. And thus John Webster then comes to the end of a play which introduces us to the ideas of the darkness that dwell in men's hearts and gives us very little hope to engage with, in the hope that men can have happiness or any possibility of even a content life.